Mark Webber was one of 3 drivers in contention for the 2010 Formula 1 World title in Abu Dhabi in the final round. A driver who is also often regarded as one of the better number 2 drivers and perhaps one of the best drivers to never win a world title. But exactly how good was Mark Webber against Sebastian Vettel? Now, this is a series that I would like to run for the foreseeable future, comparing all of the teammates from, around the mid-2000s up until the present day. And we are starting with Mark Webber versus Sebastian Vettel. If you'd like to suggest another teammate pairing, please let me know down in the comments below and I'll choose one of the better ones. We're not going to be looking at things like finishing positions, points scored, and things like that, as those are super easy. What I would like to do instead with this series is take a look at all of the lap times set and the clean air running. As you know, I like the clean air lap algorithm that I have used for the race data analysis and a bunch of other things like that to isolate their race pace and see exactly how strong they performed against each other, with the aim of then creating just this sort of interconnecting web like the AWS qualifying graphic of who was the fastest driver. They created an intricate web of teammate connections. I'll then hope to create something a little bit like that to determine who was actually really decent in race pace. And obviously the more of them that I do, the more connections and the more links and the more data that I have, and we can see who is performing really well. So we've got to start first with our methodology, and we're just going to take a brief look at just 2 drivers, driver A and driver B. There are 20 consecutive laps for an entire race distance. There is a 5-step process that I've gone through to isolate their race pace, and step number 1 is to remove lap number 1, VSC laps, safety car laps, red flag periods, pit stops, and any slow laps. And then we end up removing a couple of times, maybe 10%, maybe 5% of the total lap times raced. Then from this new selection, we end up with step number 2, which is identify just the clean air laps that each driver set. For a full explanation of exactly how the clean air laps are decided, I'll pop a little explanation in the description down below, and also it's mentioned in my race weekends data analysis for the race edition. Then with this new selection of laps for driver A and driver B, we move on into step number 3, which is to remove the fastest 10% of lap times and then also the slowest 30% of lap times. Now this just provides us with an extremely nice middle range, especially as the drivers that have competed in 2019 onwards sometimes come in for a pit stop at the end of the Grand Prix to set a blisteringly fast lap time just the once, and that will end up pulling their average down unfairly. And then the slowest 30% again just helps to remove those slightly slower laps that the drivers had. Then after excluding the fastest 10% and the slowest 30%, we can move on into step number 4, which is to identify the laps that were set on the same lap for driver A and driver B. Now what this does, after highlighting those same laps, is negate any fuel instances, as choosing laps where both drivers are on the same lap, they are therefore on pretty much identical fuel loads. Whereas if I was to compare the first 20 laps from driver A to the last 20 laps of driver B, there is going to be a fuel disparity, and driver B will end up being the faster car. Now, one step that has not been considered is the overall strategy and tyres and things like that, as there could be split strategies. Now, split strategies are definitely not common in all of this, so they're not going to play a significant impact on the averages, but they will have an impact on the averages if they do come up. However, in order to negate for the split strategies, it would take an enormous amount of effort, and quite simply, that is effort that I just don't have the time to give. Otherwise, these videos would end up coming out probably once every 2 months, and it would take me an awful lot of time. So just note that the overall averages could be affected by split tyre strategies and split race strategies for the 2 drivers, but do know that they are slightly uncommon. They are not the most common things, so they're not going to impact it too heavily. Then after identifying the laps set on the same lap, we end up with 3. So from a 20 lap pool, we end up with 3 chosen laps for each driver. Now, sometimes there can be 4 laps, sometimes there can be 5, etc, etc. But sometimes we end up whittling down the entire race pool by over 75% in order to pull up these lap times that we can easily and accurately, and more importantly, fairly compare. And that leads us on into step number 5, which is to calculate the percentage difference. And for those that don't know, the percentage difference is simply calculated by doing 1 minus the driver A lap time divided by the driver B lap time times by 100, where a positive percentage value would be an advantage for driver A and a negative percentage value would be advantage for driver B. With the percentage differences for this example looking a little bit like this, we can then just directly average these 3% values and we end up with a total average percent across this entire Grand Prix in favour of driver B by just 0.05%. Where for tracks like Spa, Malaysia and then also Singapore, 0.05% would equate to around half a tenth. Whereas for a track like Monaco, Canada and also Austria, this would equate to about 700ths, maybe 800ths. And with the methodology of exactly how this has all worked out, we will now take a look at comparing Mark Webber versus Sebastian Vettel, and we start with their first year as teammates, 2009, and we end up with a graph that looks a little bit like this. We have 0 at the bottom all the way up to plus 2.5%, and mapping on the percentage values for each of the races, we end up with a graph that looks like this, where Mark Webber is in the blue and Sebastian Vettel is in the red. However, in the races counted, Mark Webber was never in front. So for 2009, 9 out of 17 races were counted, with Belgium being excluded because there were not enough clean air laps for Mark Webber after the truncation period. Monaco, Hungary and Europe were all excluded because again, not enough clean air laps for Sebastian Vettel after the truncation. Malaysia and China were excluded because they were both rainy races and that just impacts it far too much. Australia was an extremely anomalous event. I'm not entirely sure what went on there. Vettel was faster by about 6.7%. And then Spain was also excluded because neither driver after the truncation period had set any lap times on the same lap. And then averaging out these 9 races, we end up with a gap in favour of Sebastian Vettel of just over 0.5%. And it was 9 races ahead for Vettel compared to 0 for Mark Webber, where 0.52% roughly equates to just over 3.5 tenths at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just over half a second at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So a very dominant year for Sebastian Vettel. However, we will now take a look at 2010, and we end up with a graph that looks a little bit like this, and mapping on the percentages, we can see that Mark Webber is finally in front, with again Mark Webber being in the blue and Sebastian Vettel in the red. There were 11 out of 19 races counted this season, with Bahrain, Europe, Italy, South Korea and Abu Dhabi all being excluded because there were not enough clean air laps for Mark Webber. And then Belgium was also excluded because neither driver set enough clean air laps after the truncation period. With Australia, China, Belgium and also South Korea, races that had already been excluded but would have been excluded anyway because they were rainy. And averaging out all of these percentage values, we end up with it being an advantage for Mark Webber by just 0.19%. So not as significant as the 2009 advantage, but definitely advantage to Webber, with 2 races ahead for Sebastian Vettel and 9 for the Australian, where 0.19% roughly equates to just over a tenth, almost a tenth and a half at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just under 2 tenths at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So it is now 1-1 for both of the Red Bull drivers. And then from 2010, we'll take a look at 2011. And again, plotting on their race pace for this year, we end up with a graph that looks a bit like this, where there were 14 out of 19 races overall that were counted, with Italy being excluded because there were not enough clean air laps for Mark Webber, with Abu Dhabi also being excluded because there were not enough clean air laps for Vettel, as he retired fairly early on in the Grand Prix, with Canada, Britain and Hungary also being excluded because they were rainy races. And averaging out all of these percentage values, we end up with Vettel being faster. It is now 2-1 by just 0.1% this year, where there were 9 races ahead for Sebastian Vettel and just 5 for Mark Webber, where 0.1% roughly equates to 7 to 8 hundredths at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just over a tenth of a second at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. And then moving from 2011, we'll take a look at 2012, and taking a look at the season's race pace and plotting on the graph, we end up with an extremely uppy-downy undulating graph, where both Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber are extremely quick in alternating races for the first half of the season. However, come Italy onwards, in Sebastian Vettel's happy hunting ground, he is significantly faster than Mark Webber. 16 out of 20 races were counted for this year, with Europe being excluded because there were not enough clean air laps for Mark Webber. Belgium was excluded because there were no lap times set on the same lap after the truncation period, with Malaysia and Brazil being rainy races and therefore also excluded. And averaging out each of these dots, we end up with Vettel once again being the faster of the two Red Bull drivers by just 0.19% this time, where he was ahead for 12 races compared to 4 races for Mark Webber, with 0.19% being roughly 1.5 tenths at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just under 2 at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. Then from 2012 we move on into their final teammate pairing in 2013, with the overall season's pace looking a little bit like this, plotting it onto the graph. We see again in the second half of the season, apart from in Japan, Sebastian Vettel really enjoys the second half of the season. There were once again 14 out of 19 races counted in this year, with China, Britain and Italy being excluded because Webber didn't set enough clean air laps, with Abu Dhabi also being excluded because neither driver set any lap times on the same lap after the entire truncation period. Malaysia was also excluded because it was a rainy race. Then averaging out all of these dots, we end up with an advantage in favour of Sebastian Vettel once again by just 0.18%. Where there were 10 races in front for Sebastian Vettel and just 4 for Mark Webber, with 0.18% being roughly 1.2 tenths to 1.3 tenths at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just under 2 tenths at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So with the 5-season breakdown of Mark Webber and Sebastian Vettel all concluded, what does it look like in just one graph, the big end picture of their year? And that looks a little something like this. Plotting on each of the percents at the end of the year, we end up with a graph looking a bit like this, where Mark Webber was only faster across an entire season in just 2010. And across this 5-year span, there were 64 out of 94 races that were counted, with 12 races being excluded due to not enough clean air laps for Mark Webber, compared to just 5 for Sebastian Vettel. There were 12 rainy races overall, 3 races where neither driver set any of the same laps after the truncation period, and there was 1 anomalous race. And averaging out these 5 points, we end up with an advantage in favour of Sebastian Vettel by just 0.16% across 5 years. However, there were 42 races where Sebastian Vettel was the faster car, and almost half that, 22, for Mark Webber, where 0.16% roughly equates to just over a tenth of a second at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just under 1.5 tenths at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So to be around a tenth and a half slower per lap in race pace across 5 years for Mark Webber to Sebastian Vettel, that is not a particularly large gap, and definitely closer than a lot of people might think. And there we go, there is the end of the first teammate comparison of who is faster over their teammate stint. Please let me know in the comments down below what you found most interesting about this little video here, and then also please do suggest another teammate pairing, preferably one from about, 2005, 2006 onwards. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.